Welcome to Monobiology. In today's lesson, we're going to learn a little bit about experimental design. How is an experiment put together, and what are the different parts that make an experiment scientific? Some of the terms that we're going to look at in this lesson include dependent variable, standardized variables, independent variable, control, hypothesis, and levels of treatment, as you can see. Hopefully this lesson will allow us to shed a little light on how experiments work. Come on, that was funny. I'm a very funny person in case you haven't had me before, or if you don't know already. I'm very funny. All right, let's move on. All experiments begin with some sort of a question or a problem. The problem is usually formed into a question so that it can be answered by the scientist. For instance, how does the tone of Mr. Monahan's voice affect the terror levels of his AP biology students? It's a pretty good question. In this question are two very important aspects of an experiment. One is the independent variable, and the other is the dependent variable. And it's very important that you understand the difference between these two things. So what is the difference between the independent and the dependent variable? The independent variable is the variable that the experimenter, or the scientist, manipulates. The dependent variable is the variable that the experimenter or the scientist measures as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable. In simpler terms, the independent variable is the one that the scientist alters or changes. The dependent variable is the one that they measure as a result of the changes that they make. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to copy this question down, and I want you, from the question, to identify the independent and the dependent variables in the question. Notice I've used red to denote the independent variable and green to denote the dependent variable. I want you to pick two colors. I want you to pick one color to be the independent variable and the other to be the dependent variable. I want you to underline the part of this sentence or question that you think is the independent variable, and I want you to do the same with the dependent variable. Put the video on pause and unpause it when you're ready to see the answer, but you have to try it first. Don't cheat. Remember that the independent variable is the one that the experimenter is going to change. So the tone of Mr. Monahan's voice is in fact the independent variable. Whereas the terror levels of the AP biology students is the dependent variable. Hopefully you got that right. If not, you're going to get lots more practice in class. After the problem has been identified and you've identified the independent and dependent variables, the next thing a scientist would do would be to form a hypothesis. Now, the hypothesis should answer the question, how does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? So for our hypothesis, we might say something like, the scarier the tone of Mr. Monahan's voice, the more terror will be inflicted upon his AP biology students. Or you might say, the sillier Mr. Monahan's voice, the more terror will be inflicted upon his AP biology students, because it would be kind of weird if I was trying to scare you by being silly. That would just be creepy. So you might be creeped out by that. Anyway, you write your answer to that question. It has to show a cause and effect relationship, generally speaking, in science. Okay, so how does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? Once you've identified your hypothesis, you've made a prediction about what you think is going to happen, what what a scientist does is they identify the levels of what we call the levels of treatment. So in other words, I'm not just going to use a scary voice when I try and scare you. I'm going to use several different voices. I'm going to use an angry voice. I'm going to use a sad voice. I'm going to use a happy voice, a stern voice, a maniacal voice, and a silly voice. I'm going to try all those different types of voices for my experiment to see which one scares you the most. Now the other problem here, we're getting to a point in our experiment where we have to decide, is this something that can actually be scientifically measured? In other words, can I actually measure the terror levels of AP Biology students? Is that something that I can measure? Or is it subjective? Because if something is too subjective, i.e. more based on opinion, then it's not very scientific. So if we have something that we can use to measure terror levels, perhaps we could hook up something to people's brains and we could measure the fear centers of the brain. That would be scientific. But if we're just saying, oh, well, how scared were you on a level of, 0 to Mr. Monahan's crazy, that's way too subjective for a type of experiments that we would like to do. So you have to ask yourself, is the dependent variable something that can actually be measured? And if the answer is no, it's not very scientific. If the answer is yes, then it is scientific and you can proceed with your experiment. Another aspect of an experiment would be the standardized variables and also a control treatment. So what is a standardized variable? So let's say we were going to go ahead with this experiment. We found a way to measure the terror levels of the AP Biology students. What we need to then do is come up with the conditions under which we're going to test our hypothesis. And so what we would have to do is we'd have to come up with, for each treatment level, the other variables besides the independent and dependent variable that we would want to standardize or keep the same throughout. Now I want you to think about this. If I changed more than one variable, would I actually be able to tell if the independent variable was affecting the dependent variable? And the answer, of course, is no. If I change more than one thing, who's to say the independent variable actually had an effect on the dependent variable? It could be one of the other variables that I didn't control or standardize. Okay? So a standardized variable is a variable, those other variables within an experiment that we must keep the same for all levels of treatment. For example, I'm going to use an angry voice, a sad voice, and a normal voice in my experiment. I'm going to have 10 students in each group. All of the students are relatively the same age, have had the same amount of sleep, they've had the same amount of food, they're all approximately the same athletic ability, and the temperature of the room is going to be 20 degrees Celsius. And they're all going to be in the same classroom, sitting in the same types of chairs. All those things that I just talked about there, for the different groups of individuals who are going to be involved in this experiment, are standardized variables. The temperature of the room, the amount of food that they ate, the amount of sleep that they got. All those things have to be kept as constant as possible within my treatment levels so that I can have a fair experiment. Now, notice, the 3 levels that I gave were angry, sad, and normal voice. So like this would be like my normal voice. It's not too scary, I hope. But that's my control treatment. My normal voice. A control treatment is either setting the independent variable to 0, which I can't do in this case. I guess I could kind of sit you in a room and not talk at all. That would be kind of freaky too. But it's either setting it to 0, the independent variable to 0, or the control treatment is setting an average. So if I'm going to do tone of voice, angry and sad, what's in between that? Well, that would be normal voice, like I'm talking now. So one group would get angry, one group would get normal voice, and one group would get Sad, Mr. Monahan. And which one would be the scariest? Well, I guess we'd have to do the experiment to see. So I hope this sheds some light on some of the different aspects of experimental design. And that, in a nutshell, is what you need to know for tonight. Bring your questions to class.